Hello, I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro.
Welcome to Shake and Not Burn. Every day we're bombarded with headlines of crisis and disruption, from climate shocks to inequality to AI upheaval.
But behind the noise are choices, patterns, and opportunities. What we need is sustainability literacy, the clarity and confidence to interpret complexity, see trade-offs, and make decisions.
Our podcast goes beyond the headlines to uncover how real people are tackling change and what we can learn from them.
You can use these ideas to stay steady, even unshakable, in a world that feels uncertain.
This is Shaken Not Burned. And welcome back to Shaken Not Burned, where we cut through the acronyms and the arguments to make sense of what's really happening in climate and sustainability. Today we're looking ahead to COP30, UN climate conference that's going to take place this November in Belém in Brazil, right in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. It's been called one of the most important climate meetings of the decade. But for most people, COPs feel like a bit of a blur of acronyms and negotiations and vague headlines, and sometimes they can't tell between what's being talked about one year and what's important the next. So what do you actually need to know? Why does it matter that this COP is happening in Brazil? And what could it mean for food, forests, and the future of climate action? So to help us make sense of it all, today I'm joined by Raysa França. She's a Brazilian climate philanthropy consultant with Impatience Earth, with more than a decade of experience working in sustainable economies and international negotiations. She's led youth delegations, shaped global partnerships, and now advises funders on how to channel their resources for real climate impact. Living between Brazil and Europe, she's got a unique perspective on what COP30 means both locally and globally. And she's here today to help us cut through the hype and explain what's really at stake. So before we dive into COP30, could you introduce yourself to our listeners? What drew you into climate work, and how did that path lead you to where you are today?
Thank you so much for having me here. This is the first thing I want to say. I'm super excited to share about COP30. It's very special to me because it's happening in Brazil, the place where I'm from. And even though it happens in the same country, Belém is 3 hours away by plane from my hometown. So it feels very close, but it also feels quite far and different. So my name is Raysa, like you just said, and I'm calling today from Tampere, Finland. It's quite warm, even though it's September. It should be colder, and this is also part of the entire climate crisis thing that is happening. And I would say that the main point of the work that I do is to give back a sense of empowerment and power to people, because the climate crisis feels very overwhelming. It feels very difficult to tackle. Like you said, COPs are a blur, and I think that's very representative of the climate change problems that we are dealing with. So it's very easy to just feel like you don't have power, because many times it's the truth, or to just feel hopeless. And my role, and I feel this is my role in my career, in my life, why I'm here in this planet today, is to make sure that we do not despair and that we can reclaim and do the action that it's possible for us, either as a funder, as a young person, in our own corners of life. And if I would say something personal about myself, I just love cooking and I love food. So I'm happy we are talking about food today. For everyone in the planet is making loads of choices around food and around our food systems because we are eating. And if we are part of the lucky people that have food every day, we are making these choices every day. So I'm very passionate about food and cooking, especially plant-based food, hanging out with my friends, hikes, nature, swimming, and dogs, even though I don't have any of my own. I just love taking care of other people's dogs.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Raysa. And I think what I love about this is that sometimes COP is discussed as if it is this elitist, distant process that has nothing to do with any of our lives. And I think the climate crisis has led a lot of people, especially young people, to feel hopeless and as if they've got no power. But there is a really strong movement and a really solid argument for the fact that no matter where you are in the world, no matter where you are within the system, you have the power of leverage. You can make changes. Doesn't matter whether that's the traditional ways of invest your money in a pension in the right way or buy the right things. But there are people who don't have those kind of options. It's about what you choose to eat, how you choose to act. It's even the difference you can make by the way in which you choose to treat people. And I think it's really important that we actually ground our conversation about COP in the fact that we all do have that power, and it's wonderful to hear you talk about it. So for those of our listeners who might not follow every COP, What is COP30 and why should people care about it?
I want to start by addressing something you just said on the lack of power. I can say that I have felt that way for a long part of my life. I come from a working class family background in Brazil where the power distance is quite big when compared to where I live today, which is Finland, where you can basically message your politicians and they are way more accessible than in Brazil. Attending COPs gave me the opportunity of being in front of decision makers of my countries that I could never dream of. So COPs, they also create this kind of special atmosphere where power distances feel shortened, where possibilities feel huge, and it's so opportunistic because you have a gathering of climate heads from different parts of the globe, and they're all in one place for 2 weeks. So COPs can be very special in that sense.
So from indigenous peoples to young people to activists to politicians to power brokers to investors to leaders of global corporations, get everyone in the room for 2 weeks and ideas will come out and solutions may come up. A lot of people do look at it and think of it as just diplomats sitting there arguing with each other about details. I think the idea that it's though a means of throwing together many different voices and perspectives and seeing what can arise from that is actually very exciting. And it's a lens on the COP that I forget because I tend to follow the negotiations. So when the COP is happening, I'm going, what is happening in point 5, point 2, point 3? Oh no, there's been a disagreement about the placement of a comma. It's all stopped until tomorrow. That's very distancing. So the way you talk about it makes it very real. So what actually happens at it? What impact do the decisions that are made at COP have on ordinary people's lives?
So COPs stand for Conference of the Parties, and the parties here are states or countries. And it's pretty remarkable, and I say this as a reason of hope, that COPs are based on consensus. So we bring in the room almost every country in the planet, many who are in commercial or actual wars against each other, to sit and agree what we are going to do together about our shared future. So this is pretty remarkable that we managed to do that as humanity. We have 3 different COPs. So the climate COP is not the only COP that exists. So they are part of the Rio Conventions. And the Rio Conventions are called that way because an event million years ago, I don't remember when it was, there was an agreement that we needed to tackle 3 main challenges. And they were the biodiversity loss, climate change, and desertification. And this separate COPs were established, so in each of these events, countries could come together and decide how we act on these challenges together.
I think it's really important to recognize that the climate COP is the one that everyone talks about because not enough money or focus was given to desertification or biodiversity. But with the GBF, we are putting biodiversity and nature on the same track.
I think it was Dr. Catherine Richardson who said about that we have an understanding how much emissions we can put in the atmosphere. The political question is who gets to emit and how do we decide that? And this is basically the question we are discussing at COPs. So when the countries are coming together, they are discussing, should we phase out of fossil fuels? What is it going to be allowed? How do we keep to this agreement of 1.5 degrees of mitigation? And then there are, of course, all these other questions of how do we pay for this? So the climate finance is a super important aspect. How do we do this transition in a fair way for communities and workers? And how do we adapt for this crisis as well? So this agreement, it's what is being discussed at COP. So the Kyoto Agreement, the Paris Agreement, they were defined at COPs. We are celebrating now 10 years of the Paris Agreement, which was pretty remarkable. And this is one part of the conference. But besides the negotiations, we also have a huge, ecosystem around the negotiations. And this ecosystem is comprised of civil society, movements, and organizations that are coming to watch the process, to observe, make sure it's accountable and transparent, and also to lobby. We also have lobbyists in the classic sense, influencing and trying to bring the results to their interests. We have businesses, we have funders, we have individuals that are coming there to learn more about climate. And we have spaces that are called the Blue Zone, which are closed for negotiators and observers that you need a specific pass or accreditation to access. And then there is the green zone, which everyone can come. It's open to the public. And because COPs attract a lot of attention, the cities that are hosting them have also parallel events. There are events before COP takes place. There are events after COP takes place. So the entire event mobilizes way more than what happens at the negotiations, even though they are very important.
So why, given how important and the impact that a COP can have in the region, why is it so significant that Brazil is actually hosting this year's COP, and specifically that it's chosen to host it within the Amazon?
I would say that the first thing I can bring back to the Brazilian context, I was in Brazil when the last presidential elections were taking place. And the big thing in these elections were the climate question and the environmental question. So the president that was running against Lula at the time, he had backtracked a bunch of environmental protections. Deforestation at the Amazon was going an all-time high. And there was this moment, I remember this moment, I went to a coffee shop to have a conversation with this woman. She's great. She's this classic, super talkative person that connects to everyone very eye to eye. And she was telling me how she was using the climate as a way to argue for people to not vote for this other candidate. And she was saying you can have many disagreements, but it's getting really hot, it's raining more, and we need a president that takes this seriously. So the current president of Brazil, they got elected not only on this platform, and I bet this cannot be the only reason, but it's an important part of his policy, and it's an important part of his external policy as well. Traditionally, Brazil does South-to-South partnerships, which also brings us to more attention to the role of the Global South, not only the negotiations, but for climate solutions and for the need of adaptation as well. It's not a coincidence that we will be talking a lot of adaptation in this COP. And one of the reasons is because it's happening in Brazil.
There are two things I think that are really important to think about here. One of which is that there's been this historical focus on mitigation, especially in climate finance conversations, because it's easier to quantify and it's easier to understand how the money's used for a lot of investors. At the same time, I was at a water event talking to a woman from South Africa, and I was talking about this fact that we started with mitigation, and she stopped me and just said, no, actually, if you come from where I come from, all the conversations start with adaptation. And I think that's a hugely important part of what we have to understand, that there are such different perspectives, whether you're in the global north or the global south, and there's got to be a balance brought back to that conversation, which is why it's so important that it's happening in Brazil.
This is exactly it. I'm very happy that you mentioned this because, for example, floods are very common in my hometown already since time immemorial because it's part of the weather patterns of this area and it's getting accelerated with climate change.
Right.
So adaptation, of course, is more important in this context than would be, for example, in Finland, where I am right now, where mitigation is more important. Also because of which actors are emitting more is a different question. We need to also consider that this is COP30. So this is going to be the 30th edition. So we have at least for more than 30 years, because in some years we skipped, for example, because of COVID, we had a COP a bit later. We have been dealing with this crisis in this organized manner, but it has existed far before that. So some people tend to think that by talking about adaptation, we are defeated, that we gave up on trying to fix climate change or to mitigate climate change or to stop emitting, but that's not really the case. Adaptation is a very strategic choice, and it's something that we talk a lot at Impatience Earth and that we urge our founders to consider, which is resilience. And resilience considers both adaptation and mitigation. And Dr. Shinaz from South North coined this term resilience continuum, because it goes beyond this binary of adaptation and mitigation, so how we can do both of these things together. And I'm really hoping that we'll have the space to discuss this at COPs, or at least to use this COP as an excuse to discuss about this more.
I do think this is a really important transition in people's thinking, because we started with mitigation, we got to move to adaptation, but it means that we're still looking at things in silos. We're saying this is a solution to the problem. This is the solution to the problem. There is no the solution. There's lots and lots of different solutions, all of which are interconnected, because one of the things about the Global Biodiversity Framework coming up is the recognition of the connection between nature and carbon emissions. So we can't have these separate conversations. And if you talk about resilience, I think it's interesting because it's not as politicized as the term climate change. It's over a much longer term view, so you can understand that both mitigation and adaptation have a role to play. But I also think it's something that speaks to people's natural understanding of the fact that you can stand up to shocks if you're resilient, while at the same time is translatable in ways that make sense to investors. Because sustainability is a term that's been defined in lots of different ways by lots of different people. And the only truly agreed one is the one out of the Brundtland report, and that could mean anything to anyone. It's not specific, whereas resilience is, can you stand up to this shock? How do you thrive in changing conditions? How do you deal with uncertainty? And those are the realities of what we're dealing with. So I absolutely love that you brought that term up. And if only we could get the COP to actually start thinking in integrated ways about what resilience looks like, that would be fascinating.
I think that's exactly it, because the resilience framework also allows us to see things in a more intersectional manner. For example, we just had the COVID pandemic. Being more resilient means also understanding health challenges, for example, and how we are prepared to deal with these challenges. So it's not only about climate, it also considers health, it also considers gender, it also considers many other things. It also thinks of living costs. It also thinks of things that are in everyone's lives already, that we are already seeing and experiencing.
Those things that politicians talk about, priorities that are so important, we can't afford to deal with climate change. We have to deal with the cost of living crisis. We have to deal with inflation without having the conversation about the fact that they are connected. Inflation is caused by rising prices. That's related to climate change, the cost of living, the cost of energy. In the UK, if we had actually deployed the renewable energy that was under discussion in the early, I don't know what to call them, the noughties or the early 2010s, by the time we hit the energy crisis, driven by the changes in supply of gas because of the war in Ukraine, the amount of extra sudden gas we had to buy was about the amount that was going to be renewable. So we wouldn't have had that extra cost. So you have to think about it in terms of over time and what it actually means. And politicians don't seem to like having conversations about trade-offs. They want everything all to be magically a solution. And that's really not how the real world works.
And that's part why philanthropy has also a big role in here. Because philanthropic capital can invest in the solutions, can invest more in resilience when many times governments are slow or stuck, or many times lost in, or we talk about this a lot, how it's polarized times. It's very difficult to do things. I was just reading about an ESG reaction. Are we backtracking on net zero and all of this? But philanthropy has the opportunity to simply not navigate to this and to have the choice of investing in resilience that is going to produce very important results for us. And COPs can be very useful in that sense to also see where the gaps are. They are a great opportunity for change. I'm very grateful for all the campaigners and everyone who does a big work of advocacy to get agreements where we need them to be. But at the same time, this is not the only solution. So where COPs leaves a gap, we can also see this gap as an opportunity for us to act. And this is one of the gaps usually. So climate finance. So we can think, we were talking about food and how we are making choices with food every day. You were talking about costs of the living crisis. And even for things that are considered to be superficial, but chocolate is so expensive. I went to buy a chocolate bar last week to do a chocolate mousse. And it was €5, a small bar of chocolate.
Ooh.
Yes, because it was this kind of 70% cocoa.
That's driven by climate change impacts in the areas where cocoa is grown.
And we can talk about this, but we can also talk about crops, or we can talk also about water and many other things. And where philanthropy can step in is to fund the regenerative transition of farmers, for example, so they can become more resilient. And when I talk philanthropy, I don't say only Bill Gates. I don't talk only about the classic examples of philanthropy, but companies, they can also do philanthropy and they can also invest in their own supply chains to become more resilient. And this is part of the mobilization of finance that we are going to see and hear a lot at COP and at COP.
How about you run me through what are the big themes that we're expecting to see at COP? Because we've talked about how we can have these conversations, how we might be able to achieve change. But I know there's a hope for something like a Belém declaration on hunger and poverty, because I think that's an area that's been left out of the conversations. We want to see new commitments on tropical forests, and I know that Brazil is just launching this huge over 100 billion forest fund. And of obviously stronger rights for indigenous peoples, this whole point that you have to have for any agreement to be legitimate and to be implementable, it's got to be participatory, and that means everyone who's affected has to take part. So of all the different things that are going to be talked about at COP, what do you think could really shift the conversation towards accelerating action?
I would say that for me, the first thing that comes to mind is finance and means of implementation. I think we are finally at a point where we cannot run away from this anymore. This has been built on several COPs, from the Loss and Damage Fund to many other mechanisms. And I'm seeing this with hope that we are going to be able, through this COP, to mobilize more finance. I would also say that a topic that brings me hope is just transition, because the Brazilian presidency has made this as a topic of priority. So this means that once we do phase out of fossil fuels, or if we are thinking about transitions in the food systems, that we do not leave anyone behind. And this is a main topic. And why I feel hopeful about this, it's because this COP is happening in a democratic country. And there is also an issue of accessibility that I'm going to talk about. The People's Summit is coming back to COP in all its splendor. The last full edition was in Glasgow. I'm seeing also a lot of solidarity initiatives happening to make sure that accommodation is going to be available for people. Obviously, protests and actions are going to be allowed. And when you are following the negotiations, they make a difference, and they help turn the conversation to certain directions. So this gives me hope that it's going to be different. I mentioned already a bit about the adaptation part. I am hopeful in our ability of grabbing this narrative and use this as an excuse to collaborate, find partners, and find the momentum to go together. They were pushed to the Bonn meetings. So just for context,
I'm just going to interrupt for a second, because I think a lot of our listeners won't actually understand the process, because we hear about the COPs that happen at the end of the year, but actually the Conference of the Parties has a continuous negotiations process, and there are different committees that work on different problems, and they all meet every year in Bonn in the early summer to try and work through where they've got, what's acceptable, what's going to be presented for the actual negotiations. So when there's a delay in Bonn, it has a knock-on effect in terms of what you can actually talk about at the full Conference of the Parties.
Yes, thank you so much for this context. So because there was a lot of friction already, and because there were many undecided points, I don't feel too hopeful for the negotiations, but I do feel hopeful about our ability of using this momentum to push for more resilience and adaptation projects.
There are two things that really matter about the COP. One of which is obviously the decisions that come out of it that can shape the way in which economies work. But that's really, really hard to get consensus on all of these details, to get agreed frameworks that everyone accepts is really, really hard. What is amazing to me is what the COP represents in terms of international collaboration, that no matter what's going on in the world, countries come back together year after year after year, trying to move through this process. Everybody's got a different agenda, yes, but they're still working together to try and solve a problem that affects us all. And the very fact we have these people coming together and having these conversations is a really powerful signal about what's going on. And even if we don't get the agreements we want at this COP, the conversations that happen there will have an impact, and they will frame the conversation moving forward. And it's like we talked earlier about the ESG backlash. It's a bit like that. Yes, there is an ESG backlash. Yes, there are increased political risks around engagement, but people aren't stopping doing what they need to do. They're just not talking about it in the same way in case they get into trouble. Because in the end, what we're facing is, and I hate to call it an existential threat because I'm not into the whole scaring people about it, but it is uncertainty about how the world around us is going to shift. And that means we need to understand the risks that come with what's going on and the opportunities to build a more resilient future. There are opportunities, there are possibilities. And the conversation at COP every year when everyone gets together and talks about where we are and what's going on, yes, sometimes the science is scary, but we're still moving forward. And I think there is a really positive lens there that we forget when we talk about how dreadful it is that we didn't get every detail agreed that we wanted in this year's COP, which I always hear. just after a COP finishes.
Yes, yes. But we did manage to be together and to agree on some things. And we did manage to also find collaboration to move on with other things and to push them forward.
We're definitely getting more attention on food and agriculture this year. I remember a couple of years ago, there was an attempt to combine issues on carbon and issues around nature because of the food system and the delicacy of the food system and how it needs to work. We know we have globally degraded soils. We know we have people we need to feed. We know that growing areas are changing. We know that fertilizers are hugely damaging in terms of emissions related to production and also from runoff when it just gets washed off fields into rivers. To issues about nutrition, which is why I mentioned the hope for the Belém Declaration earlier. Why is it you think that food systems are getting so much attention on the climate agenda?
I want to say that I saw this process happening from the first COP that I attended when I was talking with some food campaigners, and they were saying we managed to convince everyone in the agreement to put food systems and not agriculture, and they were celebrating this. And then in the end, it backtracked. And then they said, yeah, it came back to agriculture. And now I see a whole different level of comfort around food systems.
Okay.
And around even using this language, food systems, which I see as very positive. One thing you were asking about, what is the role of Brazil? How does it change things? And this is one of the things that changes a lot because first, we have a big history with tackling hunger, with ensuring food security, with ensuring adequate nutrition. So Brazil has good examples to show how this can be done in a country with many challenges, many paradoxes, many contradictions, limitation of resources, and how we can do this on a national level, which gives us a really good ground to talk about in that sense as well. That is not only how do we ensure a resilient food system, but also how do we ensure that no one is hungry.
Yeah.
So I see this as something that is influencing on this. So the Brazilian leadership is important. Of course, all the build-up work that has been done by many organizations and campaigners for this. And I also see that the issues around food systems are more visible now as well. So as the climate crisis is accelerating, we were just talking about the costs. This is something that is visible on the consumer's end. But farmers, they have been on the forefront of the climate crisis, and they have been noticing these changes, and they have been talking more and more about these changes. So it's becoming more visible. And I think this is one of the reasons why it came to a point where we can just not talk about it, or we cannot just not do things about it.
Yeah.
At the same time, we have been able to tackle some emissions in some sectors. For example, transportation. We are doing some progress around construction. But when it comes to agriculture, it's still not where we need it to be, and it's still quite slow. And still, it's the sector that produces 30% of the total emissions.
Yeah.
And it's also responsible for up to 80% of the tropical deforestation around the world. And this brings us also to a link that is super important here, again, on why it's good that it's happening in Brazil. I talked at the very beginning about the biodiversity COP and about how they were separated. The separations are artificial because in the real world, they are all intersecting with each other. So biodiversity loss is intersecting with climate crisis.
Yeah.
So when you were talking about soil depletion and soil issues, that's an issue of biodiversity. And and I'm a super urban person. I'm the most city person that you can ever find in this planet. I grew up in a small apartment without having any contact with soil, land, without understanding food and what it takes. And it took me going to school to understand that you need pollinators to have food. It took me trying to grow some things in my home and be like, why is my chili not coming? Because you basically have to pollinate it.
Right.
So I'm this kind of person, and I want to say that biodiversity is completely intersected with food systems. So this is where we see both of these things kind of like interlapping. And despite all of this, just a small amount of the finance goes to farmers and it goes to tackling food systems. And small scale farmers are at this moment the ones that are at the very front of the climate crisis, the biodiversity loss, and they are also the very last to receive the kind of finance to become more resilient.
Yeah, and I think there's a real gap there in getting finance to people on the ground where it makes the most difference. whether it's small adaptation measures, whether it's defense against floods and wildfires, whatever it may be, I think it's an area that needs a lot more research, a lot more work, and a lot more deployment.
Yes, totally. And I want to bring up again a point that I mentioned on philanthropy. Philanthropic capital has the power to be this kind of capital that can de-risk investments, that can also be is this kind of early research and development kind of capital, almost, that you can come to initiatives where markets or venture capitalists are very scared to invest because of the risks. And this could be philanthropic capital, which is not always the case. Not all philanthropy does this, but it can be this. But it's still common philanthropy in that sense of foundations or the traditional philanthropy. This is where it can fall short. And this is also where companies have a huge power and businesses have a huge power to play, especially businesses in the food sector. They can invest in these farmers. They can invest in their suppliers to make sure that they become resilient, and they can deliver the money to these hands where common philanthropic actors cannot. So this is also an area where I see a lot of hope and where I see a lot of action. So we were again talking about the power at the very beginning of my introduction. I exist in this world so people understand their power to act, and this is a power that businesses they have. And
I think that's wonderful. It's understanding your leverage points. What leverage do you have where you stand? Whether you are a person who's decided to only eat meat 3 times a week rather than 5, whether you're a philanthropic funder, whether you're a VC, or whether you're a company going, I could make the decision to invest in the resilience of my suppliers of this food, because long term that will be of benefit and of benefit to the planet. Shouldn't say planet. I kind of mean human beings on the planet, because the planet's going to be fine. But it's just thinking about how that works and that you do have the power to intervene. You just have to know where your power lies.
Exactly. And finding where it's going to bring the biggest impact. So the first thing that I want to say is the moment where I have felt emotionally connected to the planet, in that sense of I'm connected to everyone, and I'm not here as a Brazilian person or someone who's living in Finland and considering if I'm going to become Finnish or not, but as just someone in shared humanity, was in a COP. And that's basically because it's just seeing all these different people from different cultures, different languages, different kinds of work, different kinds of ways to act, different possibilities, different leverages, just all meeting together. And I saw, okay, we are all just humans. And I think this kind of space is very powerful for that as well.
I think this speaks to this issue of being within the COP. You can see how humanity is connected and how we're all there trying to do something different. If you're outside it, you can see at a distance, it just looks like a lot of people in suits making decisions while a lot of people not in suits protest. Following along at home, if people are reading about this in November, what do you think people should pay attention to?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, that's a really great question. I want to say that most people are not in suits.
I know.
and
I
the
should be
first time I
careful
went
with
to
my
COP,
exaggerated metaphors.
No, I don't think it's exaggerated, because the first time I went to a COP, I was so worried about what I was going to dress.
Yeah.
I was so overly thinking it's just going to be this, what are people going to think of me? And then I realized that, there's all kinds of clothing and outfits and people. I would say that if people want to follow the negotiations, it would be super important for them to see what their countries are promoting. This is the first, because whatever they are promoting in a COP is a reflection of their own internal politics. So whoever you elect, if you're lucky to be in a democracy, or whoever you build, this is agreed first internally, and then it's taken to the international stage. So do pay attention to what your country is promoting and what kind of things they're championing. This would be the first thing. And then I would also try and pick a topic that is important for you and that you find that is important for your business or for your sector, or a topic that you would want if you are someone who would like to invest in this or you would like to volunteer for this. You pick one topic and you follow this one topic. So if for you is food systems, you can literally Google food systems and COP30, because there's going to be a bunch of journalists, independent media influencers covering this topic. You can also just see coffee. What are people talking about coffee in a COP? What are people talking about fossil fuels, energy, climate finance? I would try and suggest to focus on one thing because it can be very overwhelming. So many things are happening all the time. So then you can see what's going on. And like I said, gaps are not a problem. COPs are always going to have gaps because it's also just human. We are not looking for perfect action when we engage with regeneration, when we engage with resilience. We are looking for action. The gaps are also giving an indication on where we can contribute and where we can add in. So COPs can be a wonderful place to convene, but you don't need to be there. If you see COPs are failing in adaptation, you know exactly where you can act and where you would bring the most value. So don't shy away from the criticisms. Don't feel desperate that there are critiques, that there are gaps, that there are problems, because this also gives to us a roadmap of what we can do.
I love that idea that see the gaps as a roadmap. It's really, really powerful. Now, I did want to ask, we touched on this idea that there are contradictions with Brazil hosting this year's COP. Can you talk me through that?
Yes, of course. I can start by saying that Brazil is an incredibly unequal country. So I mentioned that my hometown, Belo Horizonte, it's in the state of Minas Gerais. It's 3 hours by plane from Belém. For you to have an idea, I find myself quite isolated from Europe being in Finland. It feels way further, for example, than the folks have in France or Spain. But still, I come to London in 2 hours and a half, and this is already a completely different culture, completely different language. The architecture feels very different. The food feels very different. And it's a similar process in Brazil. So Belém is a city that doesn't have the infrastructure to host this amount of people and a conference at this scale. There are basic problems of sanitation, for example. And this is an issue that has been present in many debates. I'm not sure if you've seen or if the listeners are aware of the accommodation gate. And this is an issue that prevents people from participating. So when I said it's great we are having a COP in a democratic country, it's great that we will have so much attention to nature biodiversity and to food systems and all of that. But all of this can be prevented from happening if big ocean states, it's what I like to call the small island states because big ocean. If they cannot attend because it's too expensive, or if young people cannot attend. I'm in a group of young people because I used to be very active in the youth space, youth activism space. And there were some people offering tents for $80 a night without even running water infrastructure. And this it illustrates very well the problem that the accommodation is. And I'm sensing the Brazilian government to be quite slow in addressing it. We had a long time to prepare for this COP. And it's a little bit shameful, if I can be very honest, as a Brazilian, to see this happening. On a more positive note, I'm also seeing many solidarity networks, people just opening their houses for free.
I have heard about this. People just basically going online and saying, if you want to come and stay with me.
Yes, exactly. So I'm seeing this with very positive eyes, but this is still an issue. And of course, Brazil is still a state that has oil and that invests in oil. There are some attempts to exploit oil in the Amazon near Belém, which is a contradiction on itself. There were also this news about this highway that was being built to bring people for the conference. There were attempts on having these cruises in places in the Amazon River that would actually harm the local biodiversity. Thank God they were not authorized by the environmental body. So that's good. So these are also some of the contradictions that we are seeing. And I also need to give you a little bit of the context in Brazil, because there is also this narrative that I see as more weak now than it was maybe 10 years before. But I still hear sometimes that we need to exploit and use oil in Brazil to make sure that we have social development. Fair reaction. That's a fair reaction. And this is something that especially people in the 90s would say. I had a geography high school teacher that used to say this kind of things. This is just created, so we are not developing. He changed his mind, like many people. But we also see that there is a lot of funding for social projects coming from oil. For example, there is an amazing project in Rio where they created the social solidarity economy kind of place with basic income experiment. So basically, that's the idea that every citizen would get an amount per month from the state. And this is funded with oil money. So there's also these contradictions in Brazil.
I think discussing the contradictions inherent in holding the COP in Brazil actually highlights the contradictions and the trade-offs that we have to acknowledge and deal with when we're trying to resolve climate, nature, biodiversity challenges. Because I understand why Brazil, as a country looking to generate hard currency, would want to exploit its oil reserves and make money. And that's the ongoing debate about why shouldn't it be allowed to do what global north countries did for 150 years. Well, not oil. That's been like 100 odd years. But they exploited it, caused all the problems, and now we're telling everyone that you can't do it. So there is this real imbalance, this inequity in how we're supposed to address this. And I think one of the challenges is it doesn't really matter. We have to stop subsidizing fossil fuel use. It used to be that the fear in the oil market was that we would run out of oil. Now the fear in the oil market is the demand for oil will collapse. And countries are sometimes loath, despite the G7 agreeing to cut fossil fuel subsidies, no one's done anything about it because nobody wants to be the one doing it. Nobody's prepared to have the hard conversations. What's important is recognizing these contradictions and making sure they are part of the conversation, whether it's about inequality, whether it's about accessibility, whether it's about hypocrisy, whether it's about how you fund social development with, fossil fuel revenue. These are inherent contradictions in every society these days. So actually holding it in Brazil and having that as the starting point for all of these conversations and framing it that these are the fundamental conversations we have to move forward, I think is very exciting.
Yes. And it's an opportunity to bring these contradictions to light. And like I said, there is no perfect solution to the climate crisis, and we will never have one. What is important is that we keep active and that we keep looking for them. So there's going to be contradictions, and our best way to deal with them is seeing them eye to eye. And something that I was also thinking, because my role at Impatience Earth is especially advising donors and funders how to do best climate philanthropy, is that this is a great way of seeing exactly, again, where the gaps are and where we can invest. Because if we are thinking about a just transition, the concept of just transition talks a lot about this. We don't want to leave anyone behind. We don't want to say, hey, Brazil, just don't use oil anymore and whatever. You deal with it. You deal with the economic consequences. Your workers deal with the economic consequences of it. Everyone that has had an old car that just runs on this kind of gas is just like, it's your problem now. We don't care about you. No, there is a bad way of doing this, and we don't want to go there.
And it's real people's lives that have to be addressed.
Yes, exactly. And when it comes to this unbalanced dynamics between North and the South, funders, they have an opportunity to invest in the South and to invest in a way that is fair and to invest where all the solutions are. Yeah, this also gives a good opportunity for us.
So I think that's a wonderful note on which to end our conversation, because I think this idea that philanthropy can accelerate things like inclusive finance, that it can find solutions that perhaps haven't been considered and take that risk to help solutions to these problems scale, is just indicative of the kind of potential that surrounds the COP, whatever actually happens at the COP. Thank you once again,
Thank you so much.
So to our audience, that was Raysa França helping us unpack what COP30 is really about, from food and forests to the role of philanthropy and civil society. If you take one thing away from our conversation today, take this. These negotiations aren't abstract. They're not an elite process that happens at a distance, because even if they literally do, the decisions that are made in a COP shape the food we eat. They shape the forests that regulate our climate, the oxygen levels, water. These decisions make a difference to the rights of communities on the front lines of the changes that we face. So as we get closer to COP30, don't just think about the headlines and the pledges, the photo ops and the politicians. Pay attention to the promises, whether those promises connect to real action. And that's action on food, on carbon, on hunger, on land rights, on protecting nature. Thank you for listening to Shaken Not Burned, where we try to turn climate complexity into clarity. If this helps you make sense of what's coming, then share it with a friend and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Until next time, stay curious, stay resilient, and let's make change happen together.